Hello, chess fans. Today, we're exploring one of the most exciting openings in chess, the Sicilian Defense, specifically the dragon variation. This opening is known for its aggressive play and tactical complexity. So, grab your boards and let's get started. The game begins with e4, which is one of the most popular opening moves. Black responds with c5, entering the Sicilian Defense. This opening is all about counterattacking and asymmetrical positions. White plays knight to f3. At this point, black can choose to go into the dragon variation with g6. This is where the fun begins. The dragon variation is named after the dragon-like pawn structure that forms on the board. But what happens when white doesn't know the theory? I'll show you a sneaky trap that can catch your opponent off guard. White opts for bishop to c4, trying to control the center and target f7, black plays e6, which serves to blunt the bishop's influence on the board. After knight to c3, we see bishop to g7. Black's strategy here is to fianchetto the bishop, exerting pressure along the long diagonal. White will typically respond with castling kingside for safety. Black develops the knight to c6, and white plays d3 to prepare for the development of the other bishop. Black responds by developing the other knight to e7. Now, if white plays bishop to e3, attacking the c5 pawn, can you find the best move for black? Black plays d5. After some pawn exchanges, white retreats the bishop to b3. Black continues with d4, forking the bishop and the knight. This move creates a powerful threat, and black is poised to win a piece. Here are a few games in which I played the dragon variation. Game 1 starts with e4. c5. Knight to f3. g6. c3. Bishop to g7. d4. We trade pawns. I move my knight to c6. e5. e6. My opponent develops the knight to c3. d5. My opponent moves the bishop to b5. I respond by developing my knight to e7. Short castle. My opponent develops the other bishop to g5. I slide my queen to c7. We then exchange pieces. My opponent advances the knight to b5, putting pressure on my queen. I respond by moving my queen to b6. My opponent places the knight on d6. f6. The bishop retreats back to c1. F takes e5. My opponent takes my bishop. I respond by capturing the knight. D takes e5. We exchange knights. My opponent moves the rook to e1. In this position, I missed a tactic. Can you find it? Black takes the pawn on f2, delivering check. King is forced to h1. Black moves the rook to c2. The only move to continue is to sacrifice the bishop. If white makes any other move, then it is forced checkmate. Back to the game. I capture the pawn on b2 with my bishop. My opponent then shifts the rook to b1. I take the pawn on f2, delivering check, which forces the king to h1. I move my bishop to c3, attacking the rook. My opponent responds by moving the rook to f1. I capture it. My opponent takes my queen, but I then capture their queen on f1, delivering checkmate. Game 2 starts with e4. c5. Knight to f3. g6. d4. C takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight to c6. My opponent moves the knight to b3. I respond by developing my bishop to g7. They then move their knight to c3. I follow up by bringing my knight to f6. f3. Short castle. My opponent slides the bishop to e3. e6. Queen to d2. d5. E takes d5. Long castle. I move my bishop to e6. My opponent develops their bishop to e2. a5. a4. Queen to c7. Bishop to h6. Rook f to d8. h4. d4. My opponent advances the knight to b5, threatening my queen. I relocate my queen to b6. We then exchange bishops. g4. I take the knight on b3. My opponent captures my bishop. I then move my knight to b4. h5. d3. Bishop retreats to f1. Rook a to c8. King moves to b1. Rook to c2. Queen moves to f4. I slide my queen to f2, applying pressure on b2. My opponent resigns. Game 3 starts with e4. c5. d4. c takes d4. c3. d takes c3. Knight takes c3. g6. My opponent plays knight to f3. I respond by placing my bishop on g7. They then develop their bishop to c4. I move my knight to f6. e5. Knight to g4. Bishop to f4. Knight to c6. h3. I take the pawn on e5. My opponent then plays queen to d5, attacking my knight and the pawn on f7. I capture the bishop. My opponent responds by taking my knight. Short castle. Long castle. e6. Knight to b5. d5. Queen to c5. e5. Bishop to h2. d4. Rook h to e1. Rook to e8. My opponent advances the knight to d6, threatening my rook. I respond by moving my rook to e6 to attack the knight. The knight then retreats to e4. I place my queen on b6. Queen moves to d5. h6. Knight to c5. In this position, I missed a tactic. Can you find it? Black can move the knight to b4, targeting the queen. White responds by moving the queen to c4, but black can then play rook to c6, winning the knight. Back to the game. I retreat my rook to e8. My opponent captures on d4 with their rook. I respond by taking the rook. My opponent then captures my knight. I develop my bishop to f5. My opponent captures e5 with their bishop. I move my rook from a to c8, attacking the knight. My opponent takes my bishop. I capture the knight, forking the king and queen. My opponent resigns. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you can stay updated with all our latest content.